This is a CBC podcast.
Tanse Anine Boujou, hello and welcome. This is Unreserved on CBC Radio 1. I'm Rosanna Dearchild. She's been called Canada's relentless moral voice for First Nations equality and has worked as a tireless champion for the rights of Indigenous children and their families.
If we can raise a generation of First Nations kids who never have to recover from their childhoods and a generation of non-Indigenous children who never have to say they're sorry, then I think we have made a major step in co-creating a society that our ancestors always dreamed of and that our great-great-great-grandchildren would be proud of.
Cindy Blackstock led a landmark human rights challenge against the Government of Canada and won. Her advocacy work resulted in hundreds of thousands of services being provided to First Nations children, youth, and families. Cindy is a member of the Gitxsan First Nation. She's the executive director of the First Nations Child and Family Caring Society and a professor at McGill University's School of Social Work. She's also my guest on the show today. We'll talk about overcoming the racism she faced as a child, being spied on by the Canadian government, and how one little boy inspires her to keep going. But most importantly, you'll hear how one person can make meaningful, dramatic change. Cindy, welcome to Unreserved.
Thanks, Rosanna. It's good to be here.
You are based in Ottawa now, but you grew up in northern BC. Tell me about your family and how you were raised.
Sure. I grew up, I say to people, in the huckleberry patches of northern BC because my family was with the Forest Service, so we moved around a lot in those days. So we moved about 11 times before I was 16 years old. So there is no kind of hometown. It was a lot of meeting new people and new spaces. And that kind of shaped my life because I was pretty comfortable in that kind of introduction and walking into places that are unfamiliar to me. I remember the racism in northern BC. This is in the 1960s and 70s. And it was very thick. I won't even say subtle because there was a clear expectation by many non-Indigenous people in northern BC at the time that Indians, as we were called back then, wouldn't grow up to be anything but people on welfare and taking everything from everybody else and not working very hard. And that didn't square with the perception I saw around me of hardworking people who cared about not only their families and communities, but everybody in the world and the environment they lived in. So that kind of contrary kind of view of First Nations folks really gripped me.
I understand that your father was Gitxsan.
Yes.
And your mother was non-Indigenous.
That's right.
Right.
That's right.
And so were you treated differently by people if you were out with either your father or your mother?
I think so. I think when people would perceive me as First Nations, or those kind of overlapping broad brush stereotypes immediately took effect. That's the potency and danger of stereotypes, is that they don't account for the individual. They just apply these broad generalizations, mainly negative generalizations, to a whole group of people. And then even more dangerously, as a child, you start to believe them, right? So you start to internalize this thing like, I'm not smart enough, I'll never really be able to do anything. And, that becomes part of a cloud that just hovers over your identity until, if you're lucky enough, you meet people and you have experiences that break through that. But it is very, very difficult.
Yes, certainly. So, Cindy, how did that inform how you thought about your future when you were growing up?
I never wanted to grow up to be on welfare. I wasn't sure what I wanted to do, but one of my family members from my mom's side of the family came to a small town we were living in called Topley, BC, and I was 5 years old. And I heard about this place where you could go learn anything you wanted to be, and it was called UBC. And at the time, my first job was being a pine cone picker. I'd go out and with the gunny sacks and collect pine cones, and they were used for reforestation. I did that when I was about 4. And so at the time of this conversation, I think it was $1,000 to go to UBC. And my math was never any good. I was never a math whiz. But I knew that that was more pine cones than I could pick in a lifetime. But still, I was determined to go there, right? There was always this kind of rebel streak in me that, you know, I'm not going to be fenced in by these half-baked stereotypes of other people. Even though I'd internalized them, I resisted them at the same time.
Yeah. Now, as you said earlier, there's always this cloud sort of hovering over you, and you didn't even really have a name for it, right? When you're growing up, you don't know what's happening here.
No, you don't know that it's racism.
So, as you were trying to navigate all of these experiences, who did you look to for guidance?
I was lucky enough to have people around me who were living contradictions of those stereotypes. So going to the community and seeing my Aunt Thelma, for example, and she just recently passed away, but she was a very strong and elegant and thoughtful woman. And she stood in contradiction to a lot of these stereotypes. And there were other people like that too. And then on the non-Indigenous side, every once in a while you'd run into somebody and they didn't have those stereotypes, right? They knew that there was an injustice here. It was seeing those contradictions around me that helped strengthen my own self to be able to overcome those stereotypes. It's much easier now. Like, with children, First Nations and Métis and Inuit children, they can look around and see people like them who are doctors and engineers and great artists and wonderful parents and everything. All these professions have got people and journalists. But back then, the only images I really saw of First Nations people across the country were pretty much on, the cowboy and Indian movies. I didn't even think we were Indians because we didn't have the feather headdresses, right? I thought, that's not us. We were something different, right?
But despite the stereotypes and the not-so-subtle racism, there was this strong push in your house to go to school. Tell me about that.
I think one thing that particularly my mom was really strong on is education. Like, we're all going to be doing homework. And I remember having to sit, for example, with the multiplication times tables, which I thought back then was torture, right? I was always a good talker, so I had no problem there in the other topics, but oh my God, multiplication. But so, I think that really helped, right? Is because I had this early dream of going on to post-secondary, even though I didn't even know what that was. And I had a parent who's really driven that you're gonna finish high school for sure, and then hopefully you'll do something else after that.
This is Unreserved on CBC Radio 1, Sirius XM 169, and Native Voice 1. I'm Rosanna Deerchild, in conversation with Dr. Cindy Blackstock, the Executive Director of the First Nations Child and Family Caring Society. Now, Cindy, when you were in your early 20s, you started your career as a child protection worker.
Yeah, I actually made it to UBC,
Yeah,
you know?
you did it.
I did it.
Those pine cones.
Yeah, thanks to pine cones and a lot of other little part-time jobs that I picked up. I was one of those kids who, didn't get any money for education because I was First Nations, right? I just had to earn it myself. So anyway, I graduated from UBC and found myself as a child protection worker.
Wow.
Yeah. I was 21. And, when I think about that, I think 21 years old. Yeah. And you're doing that job. I didn't even know what the job really was until I got in there.
I want to talk a bit more about that because what you saw as a child protection worker guided where you would go next. What did you see?
What I saw while I was doing it is I saw that disproportionate number of First Nations families. It just seemed like every referral we got, it was more likely than not to be a First Nations family. And when I got out there to kind of talk to the families and see what was going on, more often than not, it was addictions, trauma, poverty. And over time, I did frontline child protection work for 13 years, and over time, I really started to ask myself the question, what do these parents actually have control over to change? Mm-hmm. If I was in the same situation, what could I change? Because there were so few services, and on reserve, there was even less. Even if you were motivated to change and want to address your addictions, that often you're left kind of without the lifeline that your family and your children really needed. So that really spurred me to start thinking about, well, who's dealing with these inequalities in these services? Whose job is it to make sure that families have the best chance to raise their kids and that kids have the best chance to have the lives they wish to have? And I was certain of two things. One is the inequalities that I saw on reserve for the services were just unbelievable. Like I worked off reserve and then on reserve. Off reserve, pretty much everything that we would ask for would be covered within reason. But on reserve, even the most fundamental things, they just weren't there.
What kinds of things did you see, like on reserve, when you say there was a lack of basic services? What do you mean by that?
Well, one of the things that just, I think still to this day is a motivator to me is that I remember a little boy with cerebral palsy, and he had a standing frame, but he had just gone through a growth spurt, right? And the standing frame was being held together with duct tape. So off reserve, all I would need to do is call an appropriate health professional to do an assessment of what he required, and then it would be paid for. But in this case, I call up Health Canada back in the day, and they say, oh, well, he can't have that because he just got a wheelchair a couple of years ago, and we only give one piece of this equipment every 5 years. Wow. I said, you've got to be kidding me. Right? I mean, I literally would say that because I was so shocked, right? What do you mean? What is he supposed to do, right? Mm-hmm. So when I saw those inequalities, I thought somebody has to do something. And the other thing I was convinced of is I was completely unqualified to do it. This is not the girl. Like I knew
somebody else needs to do
someone
something.
Someone else. So I said, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to just hold tight here. I'm going to try and work with the families and see who steps forward. This superhero is out here somewhere.
Yeah.
And
then he looked around, and that was you, actually.
Well, but without a cape, right?
And so when did you have that moment where, we were laughing about it, but when did you have that moment where you realized that you were the somebody that had to do something?
Well, my mom's sister gave me a book of poetry when I was younger. What I really wanted was an easy bake oven. But I got this book. Yeah, I know. When I was a kid, that was the thing I had, marker around in the Sears catalog, arrows. Never came to fruition. I got this book of poetry instead. But inside there's a poem by Patrick Overton, and it goes something like this. It says, when you step across that place where light leads into darkness, faith is knowing that there's something solid to stand on or you'll be taught to fly. And I thought, I looked around and I thought, well, there's got to be someone else doing something. That was the comforting thing. I thought somewhere across this country, there's people doing something. And there were, right? I was blessed to find out that there were. And there had been for many decades before I even came on the scene. Many, many people who had been trying to deal with these inequalities. So I just thought, okay, well, you know what? My strategy of just putting my finger in the dike and waiting around isn't working. So I got to step across this line. And I got over there and it's like, oh my God, now what? Right?
So there you are. You've taken that step. What did you discover?
What I realized is that if you're working on something that really matters to community members, and you're willing to do it with the best integrity that you can and work as hard as you can, keeping children at the center, then the right people are going to come around you at the right time, and they're going to be able to teach you and work with you. And it's that real building of community that creates change. And I just feel so blessed to have played a small part in this movement. But I really do want to stress there were people way before me, residential school survivors, their parents. When you walk across that line, you think you're the first one and you think you're alone. but you're really not. You just have to close your eyes, and those spirits, those ancestors come and they join you, and they call in other people, and sooner than later you find yourself doing things and saying things that actually seem to make some sense and that you never thought were possible. And that's really how it started.
Once you crossed that line into the darkness and knew that you had to do something and join this movement of people trying to bring change, what did you do?
We formed the Caring Society. Back then, we didn't even know if there was a national organization for First Nations children. All we knew is that we were desperate and wanting to work with one another and share ideas with First Nations folks across the country. And we also wanted to somehow join forces to address this inequality in federal funding.
Cindy, for people who are unfamiliar with the Caring Society, can you tell me a bit about it?
The Caring Society was born in Fredericton in 1999. It's our 20th anniversary this year. And we were just a bunch of volunteers, right? We had zero cash, right? But we had a lot of commitment, and we worked with the federal government for the first few years, along with the Assembly of First Nations, documenting the inequalities, saying, here's a solution to fix the problem. And back then I was so naive, I actually thought that's all it would take. I mean, who wouldn't care about kids? If you found out you're racially discriminating against kids as a government, wouldn't you move heaven and earth to fix it? And we finished the report. They got a nice letter in from the minister saying, yep, good work, team. But we need another more updated study. So we did the second study. And that one was done in 2005. And same thing, another letter from the government and no action. And by then I had began to understand and see the reports that had come before me of these early advocates. I thought, that's all they do. That's part of what government does, is they want us to do these reports so they can look like they're doing something, but children are still suffering.
This is Unreserved on CBC Radio 1, Sirius XM 169, and Native Voice 1. I'm Rosanna Deerchild, in conversation with Cindy Blackstock on the show today. Still to come, speaking of all the reports being followed by more reports, how looking for a good guy in the history books led Cindy to a kindred spirit. A non-Indigenous doctor speaking out about the mistreatment of Indigenous kids 100 years ago. But first, Cindy, when you were starting the Caring Society, you got advice from an elder. Tell me what he told you.
Yeah, and it stayed with me. I'm so grateful to the elder. He said, we were all excited because we wanted, it sounds kind of silly, but we wanted to be able to call a phone line and hear hello, this is the Caring Society on the other side. So we're talking about that kind of stuff. And this elder said, never fall in love with the Caring Society and never fall in love with your business card. Only fall in love with the children, because there may come a day when you have to sacrifice both those things for them. And he was absolutely right. Absolutely right. Back then, we were really the only national voice focusing exclusively on First Nations kids. And we knew that it was very likely that we would be cut. And we also knew that no organization that we knew of in history that was First Nations had ever suffered a complete loss of federal funding and survived.
And you did, in fact, lose your funding. In 2007, working with the Assembly of First Nations, the Caring Society took action. What did you do?
We got the authority to file the human rights case against the Government of Canada in 2007. And we filed it, it'll be 13 years on February 23rd. And within 30 days, we lost all of our federal course funding.
You lost all your federal funding?
Yeah. Yeah, and up until today, we're the only national First Nations, Métis, or Inuit organization that doesn't have any contribution agreements with Canada. The only money we get from Canada is what they're court-ordered to pay us because of the tribunal.
And it wasn't just funding cuts, and it wasn't just, the myriad of reports that you would have to write. What other things did you have to sacrifice for this work?
I think one of the most important things that we had to sacrifice was the security of having government funding and that kind of stability. But I also had to really manage myself. I had to make sure that I always, in my private life and in my public life, that I acted with integrity. And that paid off when I started to find out that the federal government had deployed what turned out to be 189 different public servants from Justice and Indian Affairs to follow me online and in my personal movements. And we know why, because we have the email correspondence. They wanted to find out something that I was doing that would allow them to get the case kicked out of court, saying that I was doing it for self-interest things, for money on my own part, or, some other kind of crazy thing. And so they put me under surveillance for about at least 4 years. I found out about it because the federal government refused to conduct a meeting with some chiefs from Ontario on child welfare if I was in the room. And then when I voluntarily sat outside, they got a security guard to guard me. And I think, okay, what is it about size 6 me that means that they need to get a security guard? I don't even have a traffic ticket, let alone anything else. Mm-hmm. And that's where I did that privacy request through the Privacy Act, and I got all these records about what they were doing, and I was stunned. Again, it was another part of my naivete. I thought the government only spied on people who were like, a risk to society. I wasn't a risk to society. I was a risk to their long-standing strategy of using racial discrimination as a fiscal restraint measure. And eventually, the tribunal heard our allegation of retaliation. The tribunal found some of our complaints to be substantiated, and they said to Canada that they had to pay me $20,000 because they were found responsible for willfully and recklessly retaliating against me. I donated all that money to children's causes. It was never about the money for me. It was about the principle that people should be able to stand up and protest government actions using the appropriate peaceful means. And that shouldn't be something that government retaliates against citizens for.
So it backfired horribly.
It backfired, yeah.
This is Unreserved on CBC Radio 1, Sirius XM 169 and Native Voice 1. I'm Rosanna Deerchild. With me on the show today is Dr. Cindy Blackstock, Executive Director of the First Nations Child and Family Caring Society and one of Canada's staunchest advocates for Indigenous children. And now, Cindy, I'd like to ask you about one of those kids, Jordan River Anderson.
Yeah.
Tell me about him.
Here's a little boy born to Ernest Anderson from Norway House Cree Nation and his mom, Virginia Ballantyne Anderson. Mom was originally from Peter Ballantyne First Nation, but living with her husband up at Norway House. Jordan was born in 1999 on October 22nd, and he had some complex medical needs, so he had to stay in hospital for the first 2 years of his life. But finally, the family and community had worked with doctors, and they had come up with a plan where Jordan would be in a medically trained foster home close to the hospital just to see if he could stabilize outside of the hospital but still have access to the medical treatment he needed. And then when he stabilized there, he was going to go back home to Norway House, live with his family. If he was non-Indigenous, he would have done that because the province of Manitoba would have picked up the bill. But because he was First Nations, Manitoba said, well, we don't pay for status Indian First Nations kids whose parents are on reserve. That's a federal responsibility. And Indian Affairs and Health Canada couldn't agree which department should pay. So all three of these governments bodies were arguing over everything related to Jordan's services. And there were great advocates there at the time working with the family, Jordan's pediatrician and the medical team and in the hospital, of course, the leadership at Norway House Cree Nation. All these people were there saying, let this kid go home. And the government couldn't find its way to putting him first. And so he ends up staying in that hospital for over 2.5 years. And as his older sister, Jerlene Sullivan, says, in the end, Jordan died of a broken heart. he slipped into a coma just before his 5th birthday, and he passed away at the age of 5, never spending a day in a family home because he was First Nations. So we work with the family to create Jordan's Principle, which is about First Nations kids should get the public services they need when they need them. Very simple. And then it passed through the House of Commons unanimously in 2007. And then the government bureaucrats worked with the federal politicians to make sure that no child ever qualified.
When you finally took it to the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal, what did they find?
When the decision came out in 2016, it substantiated all of our complaints. It said, yes, the children are receiving discriminatory levels of child and family services funding, and the federal government was ordered to immediately fix it. The federal government was not properly implementing Jordan's Principle, and that was discrimination too, and the federal government was ordered to immediately implement it. And then nothing happened. Thankfully, the tribunal decided to keep jurisdiction, which means to kind of watch over the government to make sure they implemented the orders. And it took, now I think we're up to 7 non-compliance orders against the government to get them to move on it. To give you an idea of the depth of the number of families that were in need, since May of 2017, when the tribunal ordered Canada to implement the proper definition of Jordan's Principle, over 250,000 services and products have been provided to First Nations children across this country thanks to Jordan and his family and the many people who stood with him. And on child and family services, the budget is almost doubled. And that's only since 2018, though, where First Nations agencies are starting to get the prevention services that they need. But there's still a long way to go.
Now, you've gotten pretty close to Jordan's family over the years. I'd like to play you a clip from his sister, Jerlene Sullivan.
I think about Jordan's personality. When we were together as a family, he was so happy, and he enjoyed having the company there. It was a struggle to spend time with him on special days like Christmas and birthdays and all that because we couldn't afford the trips out. His parents had a lot of faith that maybe someday he'd be able to come home. Cindy, she promised that she would honor Jordan and his legacy by advocating and not giving up on Jordan's Principle. To know that kind of person it's an honor. It's an honor to be in her presence, and I'm just happy to have met a woman with her spirit that she would not give up. And I know for a fact that she's not given up on my late brother, Jordan River Anderson, and my family. I think Jordan would have a lot of gratitude. She's such a strong warrior for advocating for his legacy and for the children across the nation.
That was Jordan's sister, Jerlene. Now, I have the feel, Cindy. I don't know about you. What are you feeling as you listen to that?
Wow. I just am so blessed to have worked with this family, for their generosity and welcoming me into this work on their sacred brothers and sons' legacy, and to see the community of Norway House, celebrate Jordan every year with the parade. It truly is a blessing. I just really feel like if you're really, really, really lucky in life, then you get to be a part of working with people like Jerlene and her family, and to create a difference for the next generation of children and all the generation of children to follow. And on that measure, I have been so blessed.
What still needs to happen when you say that some programs are starting to move, but really it's not moving very quickly? What still needs to happen? Well,
we're actually waiting for some orders right now. One of them is on the Canada is only allowing First Nations children who are registered or eligible to be registered under the Indian Act to access Jordan's Principle services off reserve. We say that's wrong. The tribunal ordered the orders to apply to all First Nations kids on and off reserve. We would like children who are recognized by their community but don't have status to be recognized. And we also want a process for persons who were disconnected from their community through no fault of their own, through residential schools or the 60 Scoop or child welfare, that there should be a process for them to gain those community connections and get Jordan's principal services. So we're waiting for that ruling to come out. Another big one is under the Canadian Human Rights Act, victims of discrimination, that being the children, are entitled to up to $40,000 in compensation. And the federal government did not want to pay that compensation. They said that in the evidence before the tribunal, there was no evidence of individual harm to these kids. And I couldn't believe that. Like, this is just last year they were arguing this. Because we said, look, there's lots of evidence, even in your own documents, that you were hurting these kids, right? Mm-hmm. But that's their legal argument. We say that they should be paying this to the children in a pool, and so that those children can access things like family reunification services, education services, cultural services, language services, whatever they need. That is above and beyond kind of the mainstream public services that they should be entitled to.
And actually, the most recent ruling from the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal came down earlier this month. The tribunal found, and I quote, Canada's conduct was willful and reckless, resulting in what we have referred to as a worst-case scenario. The tribunal has ordered the federal government to compensate First Nations children and families harmed by the on-reserve child welfare system. In fact, Ottawa has been ordered to pay the maximum amount allowed under the Canadian Human Rights Act, $40,000 to each child who is apprehended or taken from their homes on reserve. For more specifics on who is eligible, visit our website at cbc.ca/unreserved. But there's still more that needs to happen. What else?
Another big one is capital. So, the housing crisis on reserve, Rosanna. Many communities, they would like to start something like a cultural center for youth and elders, but there's no space to do it. The federal government is now ordered to provide funding for prevention services at their actual cost, but they're refusing to build any new buildings to house those prevention services. So that just gives you a sense of how this thing is moving, thanks to the tribunal's repeated orders and stringent supervision of Canada. But it really feels like they don't make any major shifts unless they're ordered to do it. And that surprises me because this is the TRC's top call to action, right? Yeah. So why do we need court orders to get it implemented is my question. Like, this is basic equality for little kids. And we are working on something called the Spirit Bear Plan, which is for Canada to develop a plan with First Nations to eradicate all these inequalities at one go. Because if you can believe it, after 153 years, no one has ever come up with a comprehensive plan to address all these inequalities. And so it's drip by drip, program by program, and kids are suffering. And that needs to stop.
This is Unreserved on CBC Radio 1, Sirius XM 169, and Native Voice 1. I'm Rosanna Deerchild. Cindy Blackstock is my guest on the show today. Your work is often covered in the news cycles, but now as acclaimed Abenaki filmmaker Alanisa Bomsawin has made a documentary about your advocacy work called We Can't Make the Same Mistake Twice. Here's Alanisa Bomsawin.
She's such an incredible woman. Thank God we have her. Any families who are in trouble for their children, who do they go to? They go to Cindy Blackstock. And she's there for you. She's not going to ignore you. She loves children and she'll do anything for them. And I watched her in court. It is unbelievable. Like one day I remember she was questioned, but the person who was questioning her really was trying to diminish her, to humiliate her, to take away her dignity. But you can't do that with Cindy Blackstock. She just was unbelievable. It was as if she couldn't be touched. And I was thinking of her. And the next day I said, Cindy, I was very worried about you. I said, are you okay? She said, oh, yes. She says, sometimes I get home and I feel bad, or I don't know what words she used. But she says, I'm not going to get on that level. I'm not going to answer and get into that low level of, if they want to treat me like that, then you can just see how they're treating me. I'm not going to get in that place. So I just admire her so much. And she's just a mountain of power. Cindy has a power as a woman and as an educator and as a revolutionary. And she's not scared of anybody. She's always winning with dignity, and she stands there with her head high. So it's a force that I have not seen before. And we are very lucky to have her in our life. I just hope she stays for a very long time.
That was Alanisa Bomsawin talking about the work of Cindy Blackstock. In the film, there's footage of you speaking at the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal while holding Jordan's baby blanket.
Yeah.
Can you tell me about that?
Yeah. Jerlene and her dad, Ernest Anderson, came to Ottawa in 2007 to see Jordan's principal pass through the house, and they gifted then Member of Parliament Jean Crowder, who introduced the motion for Jordan's principal, with his baby blanket. And so it's actually in the original footage where that goes through the house. And when Jean retired from politics, she worked with the family, and the family would ask that we have it. So it's in our office. And that baby blanket to me is our accountability back to Jordan. It's a reminder that Jordan's principle was founded by Jordan River Anderson, and that it's not just a policy, it's not just a program, it's a sacred responsibility. And that's why there is no kind of quitting on Jordan. Mm. It's like, this is a spiritual responsibility we all have. And so I have his baby blanket, and whenever I need a reminder, if I'm feeling crabby or I'm feeling tired or whatever, I just walk by that baby blanket and I think it's time to pull up your socks, Cindy, and get back to work.
Mm. And you've been at this work for decades. And as you've said many times, the Canadian government has known about these inequalities between First Nations and non-Indigenous children since 1907. That's 112 years.
Right.
How did you know that they'd known about it for this long? Well,
first of all, thanks to, the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples and the book that came out of that from John Molloy, the historian, A National Crime. And that's where I heard the story about Dr. Peter Henderson Bryce, this courageous doctor back in the day who worked in Indian Affairs and found that, the folks in Ottawa were getting 3 times the amount of health care funding than all First Nations across the country, and that he had linked those inequalities to the skyrocketing death rates of children in residential schools. And as Bryce said back then, medical science knows just what to do. You have to even out the healthcare funding, stop putting sick kids in with healthy kids, ventilate the buildings, improve the sanitation of the buildings, and a lot of these kids could live. And the government it's wrong to say they ignored his report. They didn't ignore it. They retaliated against him to try and keep him quiet. But Bryce didn't want to be silenced, and he kept on speaking out, and he paid a price. He was retaliated against and diminished by the government, and he was erased from Canadian history books for many years until his memory started to repercolate back in the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples. And now I'm grateful to say that many children know his name. We filed, the Assembly of First Nations and Caring Society, filed our case in 2007, 100 years exactly from the time when Bryce originally released his report in 1907.
Wow. That's an interesting coincidence.
It is. And folks may not know, but one of the things that I do on a regular basis is I go over and see Dr. Bryce. He's buried in Beechwood Cemetery. I originally went to see him the day before Prime Minister Harper apologized for the residential schools, and I brought a bouquet of brightly colored daisies because they represented the brightness of kids. I wanted to go and thank him for everything he tried to do. And when I was there, I told him about the case we had filed, and I told him I'd be back when the kids won. It took 9 years for me to make that promise. And on a cold January day, Spirit Bear and I trunched down the valley at Beechwood Cemetery with another bouquet of brightly colored flowers and the decision, and I read it to Dr. Bryce.
Wow, that's beautiful. How did that feel?
You know, I looked up the hill, and there was one set of footprints, which were mine coming down. But to me, there were many thousands of people walking in those steps. They represented to me the many people whose names we don't know and can't remember, but whose works were integral to getting that decision. The people who had the courage, the moral courage, to speak up when other people wanted them to shut up, to stand up when other people wanted them to sit down, and to do what that elder told us, is always fall in love with the children, just like Bryce. It was a very spiritual moment. And I remember I couldn't help myself. I ended up hugging his headstone and saying, "Justice, Dr. Bryce, finally justice."
And perhaps a little bit ironically, Duncan Campbell Scott.
Yes, he's buried just over the hill.
In the same cemetery. He would be the engineer, as it were, of residential schools.
He was. He was the man who said no to Dr. Bryce's recommendations. And one of the things that we did is we worked with Peter Henderson Bryce's family, and we erected a historical plaque near his grave so people can go visit that today. There was already one in place for Duncan Campbell Scott, and it was very glowing. So I went to Beechwood Cemetery and I presented them with the information, and it's just before the TRC's closing ceremonies, and they were so terrific. They said, you know, we looked at the historical record, we had our historian look at it, and how do we make this right? And I said, well, take down the plaque that's there right now in case some of the survivors come by and to visit Bryce and then see his. So they did that right away. And we worked out a new text for that plaque. So you can go see Duncan Campbell Scott. He has a plaque now. It says Confederate poet because he's well known for his poetry. And cultural genocide on the same plaque.
Wow. That's powerful.
You know, I think that what we do, we need to tell the true telling of history when we share these stories. Is people say, well, you know, they'll say of Scott, well, he was a man of his time. But what they're discounting is so was Bryce. They were two people at the same period at the same time from the same church, and one of them knew that this was wrong. And he wasn't the only one. There's another guy named Samuel Hume Blake who founded Blake's law firm. And when he read Bryce's report, he said that in that Canada fails to obviate the preventable causes of death of the children in residential schools, they bring themselves into unpleasant nearness with manslaughter. So people back then thought Canada's behavior was not only likely immoral, it was possibly criminal.
It's been 100 years since Dr. Bryce was writing about these inequalities. We've had more reports, more studies. We've had the ruling. We've had the TRC's 94 calls to action. Do you feel like we're getting anywhere?
Yeah, we are, thanks to the legal orders. But I think we have to continue that litigation. And I really, because that, in my experience, is the thing that the government responds to. Let's launch something like the Marshall Plan after the Second World War, where the Allies got together and then rebuilt New Europe in 9 years. Let's do a plan like that. And if we did it, we might be able to finally say that the Canadian government has freed itself from the chains of using racial discrimination against First Nations kids. It would be the first time in the history of this country. If we don't do it, then my fear is that 100 years down the line, someone will be telling this story and saying, why didn't they do more? Why didn't those people of that period stand up against racial discrimination against little kids?
You've been doing this work, advocating for Indigenous children your entire career. You talk to media, you give lectures, you advocate for children all across the country. You traveled 190 days last year, Cindy.
I know.
What keeps you going?
I think it's that feeling of blessing and the responsibility. in knowing that if we can raise a generation of First Nations kids who never have to recover from their childhoods and a generation of non-Indigenous children who never have to say they're sorry, then I think we have made a major step in co-creating a society that our ancestors always dreamed of and that our great-great-great-grandchildren would be proud of.
And it's a beautiful dream.
It is a beautiful dream. And you know what? It'll just remain a dream unless all of us act. Yeah. Every one of us has to do what I did, and that is to kick yourself over that line where light leads into darkness and realize that you have to be a hero for kids. You have to speak out about these inequalities because they are things like the overrepresentation in child welfare, the overrepresentation in juvenile justice. Those are symptoms of the inequality. If we really want to tackle those problems, we need to make sure that First Nations children and their families across this country have culturally based equity as a base. And those are not acts of reconciliation. Those are fundamental observances of Canada's legal responsibilities and human rights responsibilities towards everyone who lives in this country. And then from there, we can build reconciliation.
When you're not building reconciliation, Cindy, how do you relax?
You know what? I've never been kind of when people will say, well, why don't you go meditate or go to yoga? I get really anxious just thinking about it, right? I'm kind of a mover. So I love to travel, and I like puttering around the house, like just to, painting a wall because I can see change in a couple of hours versus like 20 years. It's amazing what you can actually do.
I heard that you also are a fan of the cheesies.
Oh, yeah. Well, that's my stress reduction strategy.
There you go.
Is cheesies and bath bombs, And literally, when I had to testify at the tribunal, I had to go into what I call the cone of silence for 5 days. You can't talk to anybody about your testimony. And so what I did is I stocked up on bath bombs and I stocked up on cheesies. And I'm telling you, that is the cure-all. So anyone who's having to go into the cone of silence, make sure that you got your provisions.
I started our conversation today by asking you where home is for you. And you moved to Ottawa, as we mentioned, to do this work, far from your roots, far from your huckleberry fields.
Yeah.
How long are you going to stay in Ottawa and do this work?
Until the equity is dealt with. I really feel like I made a promise to the children and families to see this case through, and I'm going to see it through. What I'm really encouraged by, though, is to see the next generation of young people and not so young people really doing amazing work to educate Canadians about these inequalities and, more importantly, to do something about them. And when I look up there and I see kids of all diversity standing up and knowing that this inequality is inexcusable and demanding change, I feel pretty good about the future. I think one day maybe I will be able to go home to BC. I sure hope so.
Well, we hope you get home too. Thank you so much, Cindy.
Oh, it's been a real pleasure talking to you, Rosanna.
Dr. Cindy Blackstock is the Executive Director of the First Nations Child and Family Caring Society and one of Canada's staunchest advocates for Indigenous children. That's it for this week's episode of Unreserved. We'll be back in this radio space next week for more community, culture, and conversation. We'll be talking all about Indigenous podcasts, so make sure you tune in for that. This episode was produced by Zoe Tennant, Stephanie Cram, Kyle Muzica, and Anna Lazowski. If you want to get in touch with us, you can email us at unreserved@cbc.ca or find us on Facebook and Twitter. I'm your favorite cousin, Rosanna Deerchild, coming at you from Winnipeg in Treaty 1 territory. Thank you for listening to Unreserved on CBC Radio 1. I go say.
For more CBC podcasts, go to cbc.ca/podcasts.